the US actually sell 80% of their high-tech chip in the world. No countries blames or criticize for their overcapacity. There are always concerns and doubts about Chinese
made in China, right?
Yeah, made in China.
If China is pushing more efforts into facilitating the high-tech industries, would that really actually be a threat?
If you blame it on China, then next time you are going to blame to Vietnam. Who's going to blame for the US politicians, right?
So what up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to this new episode of BizBait, a show focusing on discussing and exchanging of ideas on international agendas related to China. With the rising attention paid to China global-wise, we've seen oceanic pieces of information about China posted every day on the internet. We intend to select some of the most controversial ones, and we invite some of the experts in international relations to have a discuss about them. Like today's topic is China's EV industry. Fairness, an essential word in all aspects of our life, trade, laws, education. When US politicians yell out getting jobs back to the US and want a fair competition, there could be a group of people in Mexico or China whose job could be at the brink of being taken. When China is labeled as one of the unfair trade competitors by the Western world, what context should we put in to interpret it? Is the surge in Chinese EV industry an unfair impact to Western manufacturing industry? Thus, our crew have selected numerous comments, news, statements from the Western world, and my job today is to present them out and hope my guest today will present us some of the perspectives. And today we invited Dr. Shen, Associate Professor of the School of International Studies of Sichuan University. Dr. Shen, welcome.
Thank you so much for that.
Okay. All right, well, I suppose we have a lot of things to talk about today, and the first subject I want to mainly discuss about is the Chinese EV industries in the status quo under the international circumstances. So what first comes to my mind is how is the sales performance of Chinese new energy vehicles, like in Western countries, if we took Germany or France as examples. And I have some data here. In German, Der Spiegel reported on June say that a recent survey showed that 42% of the respondents are considering Chinese brand cars such as BYD as their next new car. And I think that's an increase of 12 points from half a year ago. And also in France, China imports of new energy vehicles increased by 290%. We can see that the enthusiasm of the EU citizens, but if we see the real sales volume, we can see that in Germany, it sells like 40,000 units in 2023. If we look at total sales of vehicles in Germany and France, that is relatively like 3 million and 2 million units. So I just wonder, what is your response?
We need to be clear about one fact. China has definitely become the top players in the new EV industry. In 2022, China's new EVs are sold at the units of 5.09 million units, and which the number for EU, for Europe, and for the States are 3.06 million and 1.6 million. Respectively. So that means China definitely is the largest new energy vehicles in the world. This is one fact that I want to make clear. And in terms of why the number of cars sold in Europe from China are relatively low, I think the reason could be, first of all, in Europe, you already have very strong competitors from the traditional conventional cars in the Europe market. Also, with those firms, such as Audi and Volkswagen, they're all already shifting to new energy vehicles. That means a lot of the Europe consumers may choose those cars instead of Chinese new energy vehicles brand because they are relatively new. And I think the second reason is that for a lot of Chinese new EV enterprises, they're not that expertise at global marketing. And so that means the brand recognition will be significantly lower than the car manufacturers in Europe.
Right after Yellen's visit to China, in order to protect the market, maybe it's from the US or EU from the Chinese brand entering the market, they say they're creating kind of obstacles for Chinese EVs to enter the Western market, like they put the tariffs on several Chinese automakers. Also, they put some tariffs already on the automaker that has been fined before, and they put another 15 to 30% respectively to different Chinese automakers. But I just want to, if I'm a European citizen, why should I not have a free right to choose whatever I want?
I think, of course, should have the rights. But of course, at some point, each government would definitely subsidize their own industries. So it might be a very explicit way to encourage their consumers to choose the cars, new EVs from their own country. But I think definitely a lot of the governments do push to their industries to embrace new EVs. So in a way that explicitly you don't see the differences between governments to local EVs, but implicitly you will see the differences or different policies or different boost policies towards cars from different countries.
So I mean that is another kind of protectionism.
I guess
globally,
so. Yeah, definitely. I think you can see that a lot in Europe and also in the States. It's quite obvious.
Okay. So we're talking about government, and my second question is about the government, like the different attitude of the different governments from different countries. Like the CNN wrote in an article saying that China's automakers is about to take the world by storm with electric vehicle push. Of course, that's a kind of fairness portrayed by the Western media. But on the other hand, if you took a look at the Chinese government, if you watch the news, we can say that not long after Elon Musk visited to China, the Tesla and the Model Y has been allowed in the government procurement list for the first time. So I just want to know, like, how do Dr. Shen interpreted this kind of different attitude of different governments of different Western countries?
Well, I guess the whole overcapacity and the whole China new EV storm falls perfectly into the narrative of China threat theory. We've seen that China is depicted as a destroyer instead of more of a constructive player in the global markets recently by the Western media. And this has been going on for a long time and not just necessarily applies to EVs. You can see that in like Huawei and a lot of other Chinese companies. This sort of treatment is applicable to all of them. So I think that's because the whole China threat narrative is sort of the political correctness in a lot of Western politicians' narrative.
Speaking of this, it reminds me of the Rust Belt in US, where the fallen of Michigan or Detroit, those car manufacturers, that was really their golden age back in like 20 or 30 years ago. But right now it's just falling. I can see the unemployment, the drugs, the violence, everything's going on in those countries, that in those areas, certain regions, that due to the loss of the car manufacturing or those high-tech industries. So do you think that is kind of the rhetoric of the Western media? Or that's how they want to do it to prevent?
I think the whole Rust Belt issue are caused by China is a very strong rhetoric of Trump. I think for Trump's and his advocates that the Rust Belt region issue are caused by China's manufacturing industries.
But I think that the Rust Belt happened long before Trump's administration,
Exactly.
right?
Actually, the issues happened very long time ago. And also, as you mentioned, the Rust Belt represented the industrialization of that age, where car manufacturing was in its prime age and prime era. But if you look at the driving engine of the economy in recent decades, it's the high technology chips, like the high-end chips. Of course, there are manufacturing companies shifting to China market, but you have to bear in mind that the whole industry shifts, and the shifts didn't only happen because China opened up the market for the manufacturers to move in, but also with the high technology has already been taking up the economy drives.
But with the shifting of those car manufacturers like the Ford, General Motors, those US cars, they're shifting their labor force to Southeast Asia or to China or to some other countries that with cheap labor force. I think that's totally capitalism style. But how do they preserve the jobs of the US citizens if I am the US car makers on the American soil?
I guess you have to recognize the fact that all economy shifts its driving engines. How can we preserve the jobs for the car manufacturers in US?
Or I just say we maybe could find a balance between that. Maybe we can all both create jobs for
But I think with
Chinese
those
automakers or
multinational
even-
firms, such as Apple, Apple, like Tesla, all those new emerging multinational firms should be the corporations to be considered for their policymakers.
It's up to the entrepreneurs to make their decisions.
Exactly, and also it's the internal issue of the United States. If you blame it on China, then next time you are going to blame to Vietnam. Because nowadays those car manufacturers or those manufacturing companies no longer operate in China because the labor cost is getting higher and higher. And then a lot of them have already moved to Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And then who's going to blame for the US politicians, right?
The next subject I want to know is about the subsidies. And the EU Commission press release in June says that the electric vehicles in China benefits from unfair subsidies, which is causing maybe a threat to the economic of both EU or US soil. So what's your response to that?
I think I'm glad you brought up this question, because I think this is what I want to say, where you see the double standard comes into play in China and Western media. Because you see that not just China has subsidies for their EVs industries. The States and Europe has as well. There's a group of data that I want to share, is that actually the US has, back in the 2019, has already put $59 million to support their EVs battery development. And also the US and the federal government facilitate their consumers to buy new EVs and have all sort of subsidies policies. For the German government, they also actually had a $1.2 billion funding to subsidize EVs that has a sale price doesn't exceed $60,000 EU. So for all those countries, they all have their subsidies for their EVs. This is sort of a practice that applies to all those governments. But why is this such a big deal when China does this? So I think it's definitely a double standard issue. Speaking of the double standard narrative, and I would like to bring up the overcapacity narrative as well, because you know that the US actually sell 80% of their high-tech chip in the world, and no one or no countries blames or criticize for their overcapacity. So what is the definition when you speak about overcapacity?
So it has to be in certain context when we will tell the world who is actually...
I think the context is that when China sells a large amount of their high technology products to the world, then that's over capacity.
So that's remind me about the news that we collected on the shows, is that Nikkei Asia commented that electric production capacity in China is expanding at a really fast speed, despite their vastly larger than domestic demand. They kind of fanning the fears, says that they will export vehicles abroad at cutthroat discounts. That's maybe it's an economic question, because the more we produce, the cheaper we are. Why can't we just work together, to create this kind of win-win?
Yeah, I think there's a very funny thing, that isn't that the whole point of globalization and world trade is all about using the advantage of one area or region and then produce goods that at the lowest price, then export to the world. Isn't that the whole point of global trade?
Yeah, it's especially after maybe China joined the WTO and being acted at her part.
And I think the whole practice has been like this in the world, maybe since there's a trade back in the 2,000 years ago. China produces tea and then export to the Europe. That's the whole point about trade. And I think that's the whole point of world trade, is for the whole humankind to take advantage of the benefits of having goods from all over the world.
Your explanation actually interprets the kind of dilemma of the cost and the quality. And this brings us to the next statement, is that the electric cars sold in China is about 40% cheaper than in Europe and 50% cheaper than the cars made in the United States. And in the half of the 2022, the average price of China EV cars was around 31,000, compared to 55,000 in Europe and 63,000 in the United States. So despite that, a lot of maybe consumers are worrying about maybe the cheaper means that the quality is also cheaper compared to the price. What do you think of this logic? Does it make sense?
There are always concerns and doubts about Chinese.
Made in China, right?
Yeah, made in China, the whole quality thing. But I think with EVs, it's sort of a bit of a different story because we know that China EV industry starts a lot earlier than Europe and the States. And I think the low price largely comes from the whole supply chain that China has been, that the China companies, firms has been built for a very long time. So from the battery all the way to the whole car manufacturing, it's all covered.
Except for the chips.
Except for the high-end chips. And I think that's definitely one of the bottlenecks that China enterprises has to break if they really want to become the the strong competitors in the global markets.
Does that also mean that China might be shift from labor condensed industries to more like high-tech industries and trying to create more talents to facilitate this industry? Is that a trend in maybe the next 10 or 20 years?
I think it's happening now. I think that's what the government has been pushing and has been trying to move forward towards that policy direction.
So if China is pushing more efforts into facilitating the high-tech industries, would that really actually be a threat to maybe US or EU countries?
You could say that when a competitor ends in the market, it will bring threat to the existing players. But also, in another way, we could say that when the new competitors comes in, it brings opportunities to the existing players.
So Dr. Shen, like judging from this chart, like currently the top 10 sales, the vehicle brands global-wise in 2023, you can see there's only one Chinese company is unlisted. And can we foresee that maybe in the future there will be more Chinese maybe car industries listed?
Of course, I think as long as the world is shifting to new energy, as long as the new energy vehicles are continuing to be the use as a clean energy technology that we use to drive our cars. But of course, we have to bear in mind that not all markets have the same rate to accept EVs. For example, I think for countries like Australia, for their government, they may want to shift to clean energy for the EVs. But you have to bear in mind that that's a country with 7 million kilometers of land size, but with only 20 million population. So for them, I think building the charging posts and building the whole infrastructures that is suitable for EVs proliferation could be actually harder than in China. And it's a lot easier for China market to embrace EV than Australia because of the different situation.
And it's not profit oriented. Like if I want to build like electric charging posts in Australia, like that would be more costly because there are not many people that can use it at the same time, right?
Exactly, of course.
What about EU?
Of course, I think Europe is another very good region to push for the EVs, and that's what's been happening, right? It has a very good infrastructure in general for all, even for petrol cars, but also for Europe region, you could see all the cities are very close to each other. Yeah. So for them,
you can pass freely, right?
Yeah, you can pass freely, cross-border,
yes.
And it's also very populated as well. And also, of course, I think Europe definitely one of the regions that highly values clean energy and the sort of the goal to meet the carbon emission.
I think especially under the global crisis between maybe Russia and Ukraine, all those energy crises may cause the petrol soaring to.
And I think yes, for Europe,
prices for their unaffordable, right?
Exactly, for their geopolitical benefit for Europe.
So maybe that's a problem, is that EU is a really, really good market for EV cars, and China is making good EV cars. That's why they want to prevent China from entering the market, because they want to facilitate their own companies on the soil.
I think that could be a point, definitely.
Yeah. That's logic,
yeah, because
right?
also for the Europe, for EU, they would think that they've already had the competitive advantage in their car manufacturing back for the very long time. So the only problem is that they started late, so they want to sort of give the space for their EV industry to grow.